All right, so we don't know what you all know, but you have seen Portland trending on Twitter if you're a Twitter person, and you have recognized that there is something afoot. So for some...
I think it's broken out into the mainstream media as well.
Oh, clearly awareness of the Portland situation has begun to reach the outer world.
Especially now that the Chaz Chop is gone.
Right. Portland is where it's happening.
Yeah.
So what we have is a standoff that has continued for, I don't know, something like 54 consecutive nights. It very quickly began to focus on two federal buildings downtown. And basically, of late, we have seen federal agents not dressed in uniform pulling people out of these riots into what are described as rented and therefore unmarked vehicles, taking them to an undisclosed location, which appears to be inside one of the federal buildings. And in general, the reports are that these people are held for a time and then they are released, often without charge, maybe always without charge. I did see one instance in which somebody said they were ultimately read their rights, but in other cases they have not been. So in our last live stream, my conjecture was that these were indications that the rioters had triggered federal provisions reserved for terrorism that essentially suspend many aspects of the Constitution, and that in particular one should pay attention to the NDAA of 2012, which had two provisions in it essentially allowing law enforcement to pull people off of any street anytime without explaining what they're doing, showing evidence against them, suspending habeas corpus rights, and all of that. In response to that live stream, we got a comment. Zach, you want to show that comment? All right. As someone familiar with the process, I'd like to provide possible insight into federal pickups. It's far more likely that the agents are monitoring video surveillance and recordings of vandalism and directing the pickup units who surveil targets away from crowds where, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble reading it at this distance. I can't.
You want me to?
Yeah, will you pick it up?
It's far more likely that agents are monitoring video surveillance and recordings of vandalism and directing the pickup units who surveil targets away from crowds where they pick them up to get positive ID so that they can present the case to a federal grand jury. Furthermore, the fact that they are taken into custody without being read Miranda is not unconstitutional. Miranda is only required prior to interview, not prior to detention, reads this comment.
So, the officer who I have described talking with in front of one of these federal buildings on his last day as a DHS officer in Portland contacted me in response to that comment and said that it was accurate. Now, he doesn't know anything about what's going on currently because he's not stationed in Portland and he's not part of that agency anymore. But his point is that when he was in on the planning of what was taking place, this was one of the things that was being contemplated. And so I'd like to explain what this means. It does suggest that more than likely the interpretation that I had is at least not the one that the federal government is working from at the on-the-ground level.
Which, just to clarify, means that you said that what we were seeing suggested that the NDAA had been implicitly, at least, invoked, and what we are currently coming to understand suggests that may not be the case.
Yes. Now, there is slight ambiguity because when the Obama administration defended the provisions of NDAA, they said that those provisions, shocking as they were, did not actually provide any new powers, suggesting that they already had those powers. Right. But nonetheless, there's a question about whether or not a special terrorism category has been triggered, especially in light of the fact that the president has used that very term. This comment and the fact that a federal officer who was stationed in Portland says that it is an accurate explanation of what was planned when he was here suggests that something else is afoot, which is, imagine for a second that somebody is stationed on the roof of one of these buildings. They are watching crimes being committed, for example, vandalism, or projectiles being launched, something like that. They could then indicate to people on the ground that somebody was in the midst of committing crimes or had been observed committing crimes, but they wouldn't necessarily know who that person is because, of course, people are dressed with masks and other things that obscure their identity. So a team on the ground would collect individuals, take them to a cell where their identity would be ascertained by some mechanism. I don't know what it would be, but let's say facial recognition or fingerprints, or I don't know what it is. But nonetheless, that would then be used to get a grand jury, a federal grand jury, to indict, which is apparently a very different process than takes place when crimes are prosecuted locally. Now, I must tell you, there's a lot of this that disturbs me. On the other hand, what I think is missing from the Portland story is the fact that there is no good solution, that we've been left in a terrible bind by the local city officials. Remember, our mayor, Mayor Wheeler, is also our police commissioner. So he is in a position to play the George Bridges role here in Portland and to frustrate the local police so that they do not act. And this is what we have seen for close to 2 months now, with attacks on federal buildings that are obviously quite illegal, that are dealt with basically by an appeasement here locally. Now, because the protesters have chosen federal buildings, there's a whole second layer, which is to say the federal government is not hamstrung by Mayor Wheeler. So there is a division between what the local police are doing, which is to say very little, because they can't, and what the federal police are doing, which is to say they are now ratcheting up some sort of approach to protect these buildings. Now, if you're disturbed by the federal approach, you need to ask yourself some questions, which is, why have the protesters chosen these buildings? Why would they choose federal buildings? In part, the answer is surely because they want a federal crackdown. Why do they want a federal crackdown? Because they're very interested in portraying this as some sort of egregious governmental overreach, when in fact, those of us who live in Portland know that we have a problem. We have people being violent consistently over many nights who are facing very few restrictions on their behavior, and it makes us wonder whether or not violence against us will be tolerated in the same way. Now, if I can just add one final thing before we discuss this, I want you to run a thought experiment. Let's imagine for a second that I personally, just me, became agitated about governmental corruption, which I am. And let's suppose I decided to do the same thing to these federal buildings that these protesters are doing. What do you think would happen to me? I think I'd be arrested. That's what I think. And what's more, you can run the same experiment. These protests happen every night. Hundreds to thousands of people show up. And you can just ask the question, suppose I were to approach the buildings during the day. Don't you think it's likely I would be arrested for attacking these buildings? I feel certain of it. I feel certain I wouldn't get away with it, which tells you that there's something about these crowds of individuals that are not triggering the same response to lawbreaking as I would. And initially, you could argue that this has something to do with the number of people, that basically a proper law enforcement response was not easy to manage in the early days. But that surely is not the case months down the road, right? Certainly there are tactics. There are things we do when lots of people decide to break the law together, even if they initially overwhelm the system. Once you realize that that's happening, you bring in more resources from elsewhere if need be. You come up with tactics and you enforce the law. So the result of this thought experiment, I think, is that it is what the people attacking these buildings are saying, what they represent, that is causing them to be allowed to violate the law. And others of us who might have very legitimate complaints about the way the federal government runs would not be given the same leeway. I think this paints a very difficult puzzle. And what I would like to know from people who see this as somehow a positive thing is what exactly it is that they are envisioning. There's no demand that could be met here. Or should the protesters be allowed to burn down federal buildings in the heart of Portland? Is that what is being said? Because the protesters say, look, and they spray paint this on the buildings. They say property damage is not violence. So basically their sense is that they have a right to attack these buildings. The city government tacitly agrees with that. The federal government disagrees. It is its obligation to disagree. And the people of the city of Portland are caught in the middle. You have anything on this topic that you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say. One thing that I know just a little bit about that I'm not sure that I want to add to the story here is that apparently, I think it's City Commissioner Hardesty, who is as leftist as they get on the I think it's the Portland City Council. I'm not totally sure of what her position is. Has been decrying how ineffective Wheeler has been basically arguing that he has overseen this brutal police force that has been hurting people, and so is trying to wrest control of the police force away from him. And what she has in her position at the moment somehow is control over the Portland Police Bureau. And a couple of days ago, the Portland Police Bureau, I didn't prepare any of this, so I don't have all of my details here, but the Portland Police Bureau, that has 18 or 20 sites around the city, as you would expect they would, put out a statement saying, not now, not ever will we allow staging by either Portland City Police or the federal officers to work from where we are. Now, the idea that the two essential city services are overseen by two different officials is a little surprising to me. Why, if the mayor is the police commissioner, why isn't he also in control of the firemen?
So you meant fire bureau or police bureau?
Wheeler is control of the police.
Yeah, but you said
why isn't he in control of fire?
Right, and so it's the fire bureau that has forbidden the shared access of the federal officers.
But also by the police. This is the point, that the local fire department has declared itself unwilling to, and has said that it never has allowed staging, tactics, strategy, anything by local police. Also federal officers, but just put that aside for the moment.
Yeah.
It is surprising, right, that there should be this kind of wrestling near the top of city government, and the argument appears to be that Wheeler, who was clearly spineless and incompetent and unwilling to keep his people safe, is being argued that he actually is too far to the right somehow. Like he's too much a law and order guy. This guy who's let downtown Portland be in flames, have tremendous vandalism, etc.
And he is being marched to anarchy by the phony accusation of being authoritarian. And
this is making it ever less likely that he will actually step up and do anything, which is, of course, part of why we have federal officers here in the first place, because it's clear to outsiders and to most insiders of the city that this is not going to end well in its current direction.
And Wheeler has said of the federal law enforcement staff that he wants them to leave, and that to the extent that they have an obligation to defend these buildings, he says, fine, go inside them and defend them from there, which is obviously preposterous. I mean, for one thing, incendiary devices have been launched into these buildings. So the abdication of responsibility at the city level has created a federal problem, and now it is being portrayed as if the federal problem isn't, the federal response is inherently an overreach. It may be an overreach, but that it would be inherent that it was an overreach when the local authorities are simply not enforcing the law.
Right. So what do we say about this image that I think is spread far and wide now of a Navy veteran wearing Navy vet garb, right, which he says he did intentionally so that in the hopes that he would get interaction, decent human interaction from the officers whom he was facing, whom we see standing tall and proud and alone and being beaten on by police until he finally turns around and reports later that he is somewhat damaged, as you would expect he would be.
Yeah.
We know something. We have some thoughts about what's going on. You want to start?
Well, I would just say that it raises a question. I mean, it's first of all a very dramatic piece of footage that somebody is standing there and withstanding a physical attack that's quite powerful. But there's also a question about, what was the interaction that resulted in that attack? And
we've heard that there had been regular announcements for many minutes up to an hour beforehand by, and I don't know if it was the police, the federal officers, to clear the area, to get out of the area. They were going to start using, if they said tear gas, it was federal officers because local police aren't allowed to, and that looks true to me. In part because the scene is otherwise empty. In the scene these scenes that we're seeing from that particular part of Portland at those times of night for the last consecutive, whatever you said, 54 days, is always chaotic with lots of people running back and forth and everywhere. And so this looks to have been a scene that had been cleared and was attempted to be being cleared. And that presumably doesn't justify a beating. but it also doesn't make that man an innocent as he is portraying himself. And this is the thing, is how much of what we are hearing is PR and how would we know? Like that's the question always. We certainly experienced this at Evergreen when we started to see the PR machine, get tripped into gear and start making actions that they knew would play well with some part of the outside world.
Yeah.
So obviously a tall, strong, independent man in Navy wear, patriot who is being beaten on. This looks like the authoritarian madness that we are being told is rife in every police department across the country. But I don't think that's what we were actually seeing.
Well, and you have to play it through. So let's imagine that you decided to precipitate an event, and so the police say, "Clear out. We're about to come through the area." You approach them instead. You have some interaction where you refuse to go. Now, might be that what they should have done is handcuffed him and dragged him off. We don't know the situation because what we have is exactly what fell in the frame. Mm-hmm. We don't have the context that happened before. We don't have the contents of the interaction between him and the officers. And so the point is, that looks bad.
We have two types of media. And that story that we've all now seen at least pieces of plays really well with CNN and with NPR and with MSNBC. And some alternative story will play really well with Fox and Fox mostly, and a lot of minor outlets that don't have as much play. But basically all of these outlets fall prey to just reporting on the narrative that they already agree with. All right. That's what they do.
So we actually have some footage that will illustrate your point.
Okay.
So, Zach, do you want to show the first the attack on the building? Yeah.
So, frame this for us. Is this a few nights ago, last night, something, Portland?
This is in the last 2 nights. It may even be last night. And you'll see they've approached the building. They've torn down the fence, and they're now approaching the building, and they've set off an explosion. Presumably that's from a large firecracker or something, but these firecrackers they're explosives.
That's one of the federal buildings?
That's one of the 2 federal buildings that are under nightly attack. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you see that. Can you do the one with the officer now? I believe so. Okay, this is a federal officer being physically attacked by rioters. He gets up, the perpetrators get away. Okay, so that's a physical attack. And mind you, that physical attack, bad as it is, doesn't really compare to the danger of people using slingshots to launch BBs at these officers, right? I mean, imagine what a BB coming from a slingshot will do to somebody's head if it hits them. So anyway, these people are playing with very dangerous tactics and with weapons, many of which sound like they're not very serious, firecracker, slingshot, but they are very serious. Okay, but then take those 2 things on the one side. Now play the clip, the remaining clip. This is, I believe, last night. You can see there's some installation art, Fed
goons out of PDX, it said.
Fed goons out of PDX projected on the building. Got people holding up their cell phones with the flashlight on as if they were holding up their lighters, singing "We Shall Overcome." Now, what's going on here? First of all, mothers have shown up to defend the rioters.
A group of people who say we are mothers.
They are mothers. They appear to be mothers. Fathers apparently, or people who appear to be fathers, showed up to join the fight. And so what we have is an allusion to past protests, very honorable protests against the Vietnam War, for example, that are playing out in the midst of a violent and concerted attack on federal officers and federal buildings. So the point is, the edit tells you which of these things you're going to see and therefore how you're going to feel about it. Is fascism coming to Portland? Or is the federal response the natural thing that has to happen when the local authorities have abdicated responsibility? right? It's two stories that simply cannot be made to reconcile.
It plays out a little bit in across temporal lines, right? The more peaceful protests happen before dark, and the violence really ramps up after dark. So there is the possibility that someone wandering in at one time or the other would actually not be aware of the other. On the other hand, at this point, given what we know is happening every single night in Portland, every single night after dark into the wee hours, this time of year it gets dark pretty late. How could you be that confused about this being a totally honorable and peaceful protest? It can't be. It can't be at this point.
So I think the at this point is crucial. And I was talking to Eric last night and thinking about some things, and we were going back through some of the prior protests that have occurred, especially in this part of the world. And I was thinking in particular about Occupy. And initially, you and I were very enthusiastic about Occupy because it seemed like finally this was something new and different that was protesting things that needed to be protested, like the TARP program, too big to fail, the obvious catastrophe of credit default swaps and leveraging and all of this. And the thing was, there was the sense that we hadn't seen anything progressive in decades, maybe at all in our lifetime. And suddenly there was motion where suddenly we were protesting the things that needed protesting. Mm-hmm. And the problem is, inside, it then became clear that it went from a protest against it was a coherent protest to an anarchist protest. And I tried to persuade, I wrote a couple of articles, in fact, trying to persuade them that anarchism was an answer to nothing and that they needed to get back on track, which of course didn't work. But my point is, there are those who are just simply waiting for anything that doesn't look like what they've experienced. And to the extent that the Antifa riots are portraying themselves as progressive, there are a lot of people who aren't paying close attention, who think, okay, finally, right? We're in the streets, protesting for the right thing, when in fact they're protesting for the wrong thing. They're protesting for the uninvention of all of the liberal principles on which the nation was founded and to which we were headed. So,
well, and you saw more than I did, even in Occupy, as you watched it unravel from the inside, a specific rejection of the idea of leadership, right? A specific rejection of the idea that individuals should be in position of leadership or able to not necessarily dictate, but have the role of being able to help facilitate situations and groups of people such that decisions could be made. The idea of hierarchy was itself anathema, right? And so this struck both of us as delusional, right? It is this utopian vision that has no chance of actually happening. We can do better. We can certainly do better than what evolution has handed us. And we have lived in much more hierarchical ways in the past with much more rigid roles around lots of things like race and like sex than we need to. But the idea that hierarchy is itself we are either capable of getting rid of it or it is worthy of being gotten rid of. Both of those ideas are batshit crazy.
Yeah.
Like, that makes no sense at all. And it tells you right there that the movement has no chance of success in the way that it's claiming it wants success. And also, one of the ways that it works tactically is it makes it very much harder to chase it down, because who do you go after? And, one person says all cops are bastards, and another person says defund the police, another one says abolish the police, another one says we don't want any policing at all. And you go back to the first one, they said, well, I never said that. That's not my position, and I'm Antifa, and maybe they aren't. Maybe they're playing at it. And so the lack of leadership is not only insane if you try to scale that up at a societal level, but it is actually also incredibly effective at a tactical level with regard to street level riots.
Yeah, it runs through your fingers as you try to pin down what it is that we're even talking about. So this is exactly my concern, is that you've got a huge fraction of the energy here in 2020 on the nominal left is, well, got to get rid of Trump. here's a powerful movement that says it's liberal,
Right.
and look, they're singing "We Shall Overcome," right? Yeah. That looks pretty good.
If it says it's liberal, it must be liberal. If it says it's anti-racist, it must be anti-racist. If they sing those songs, they must be on our side because the people who used to sing those songs made sense. And it's really easy to sing songs.
It is, although there's too little of it. I mean, what song are we singing?
100%. Right. But this, of course we're going to, so singing a song is easier to fake than humor.
Yeah.
Right. At the point that they start faking humor, then we're really doomed.
Right.
I think. But we don't see that really happening because as you and Matt Taibbi pointed out, and as we've been pointing out for years, this is humorless.
Yeah.
It's a humorless movement.
It is a humorless movement.
Yeah.
But the problem is the intersection with the election is setting us up for disaster because so many people, I hear it all the time. People say, well, when Biden gets in, this will die down. No, the Biden camp is actually partnering with it. They're picking up the energy from this movement. Now, either you think the Biden camp is going to betray the movement after the election, in which case I would say small disaster, or they're not going to betray the movement after the election, and we're going to start making policy based on this absurd reinterpretation of reality, and we're going to have an absolute catastrophe on our hands.